Hello everyone, welcome to A Future on Waxing Wings. Today I'm delighted to be speaking with Jeffrey Ladish. Jeffrey is a fellow at the Foresight Institute, studying existential risks with special interests in nuclear game theory, biosecurity, the potentials and dangers of blockchain, and the resiliency and decay of institutions. This interview was recorded in the fall of 2019. Since then, Jeffrey has become an invaluable researcher exploring epidemiological response methods to combat COVID-19. Since early February, he tried to raise the alarm on the risk of a COVID pandemic and has been collaborating on research and response efforts ever since. We've seen the impact of a mild planetary catastrophe with COVID and the rippling second-order effects and turmoil growing out of the pandemic these past few months. In this interview, Jeffrey offers prescient insights on the future of planetary risks and what we can do to stay vigilant to the many challenges we will undoubtedly face in the decades to come. Jeffrey, it's great to have you on the show.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
We've been kind of discussing how we relate to the world, how we ethically kind of consider ourselves in relation to other people. And I think it's really interesting. Your work really focuses on this longer view of history where we're talking about, not only the lives of current humans, but the lives of future humans and the lives of the biosphere that does not exist today, but might exist sometime. And I'm kind of wondering how that developed from you, from your childhood experiences all the way through college and into your current life, how you developed your system of ethics and how you came to view the world in the way that you do today.
Yeah, so I think for me it started, I think one important piece of background for me is that I grew up a very, very Christian, so in particular a Seventh-day Adventist. And so, growing up for me, morality was sort of obvious. Like it was obvious that we should care about each other. And there was sort of a deep fundamental belief that everyone was had worth, like intrinsic worth. And the sort of guiding principle there was we want everyone to be saved. And saved can mean a lot of things, but really what I thought of it as is everyone gets to basically live thriving lives forever or something and hang out and it'll be awesome. And that's what I wanted for everyone. Then, around college, I sort of began to question that worldview and the epistemology didn't hold up. And so I was like, oh, okay, well, that's tricky. But I sort of didn't have it sort of turned out to be okay because I was like, well, I sort of think that the morality I grew up with was pretty good. I think it is actually just a good idea to treat everyone as if they have intrinsic worth. And I think it's a good idea to try to work for good outcomes for everyone in the future. And so I was I guess I can just keep doing that and I'll have to figure out what we are all made of, because that's really weird. How do we get here? That's bizarre. And then that sort of led me to study evolutionary biology because I became very, very curious about how we got here and history as well. So all right, we are here. What what's up with that? And yeah, and so that sort of led me on this journey to try to understand that. And then and then I also was trying to figure out what to do given that. And in studying history and evolutionary biology, I realized, oh man, society has gone through a lot of turmoil and for better and for worse. We've done all sorts of crazy technological development, and now we're getting to the point where our power as a species is just much, much greater than our ability to know what to do with that power, much greater than our wisdom, right? And so then the ethics of that, it seems obvious that if we care about everyone and we want everyone to have great lives in the future, or their children to have great lives, or their grandchildren, we should really figure out how to use our power in a way that's not self-destructive. And then I think sort of getting into that a little bit more, I don't know if other people have had this moment. I had this moment. It wasn't one moment, but it was a series of moments where I actually understood that nuclear weapons were real and not a story.
Yeah. Well, when you grow up, especially post the Soviet Union, it's just, people don't have that consciousness anymore.
Yeah, we've all seen
Yeah.
like movies with like and then like it's a plot device, right? It's like and then the nuclear weapon goes off and it like blows up a city, and you're like, oh, that's so crazy. But it's like no, those things exist, and there's thousands of them, and they could be fired within minutes. Like
Yeah.
that just could happen. And I think that like sort of over the course of a year or so, just getting that on an intuitive level helped me appreciate sort of the incredibly destructive potential of technology, as well as I mean, there's clearly we have modern medicine and vaccines, and we have like industrial agriculture that's allowed so many people to like live that couldn't otherwise live and be healthy. Like there's clearly tons of benefits to technology, but just taking a moment to like sit with the fact that we've also built technology that in in less than an hour could like kill hundreds of millions of people. It is like an orders of magnitude more people than were killed in all of World War II. It's actually crazy.
Right.
So I think once I realized that at an intuitive level, I was like, well, okay, I know what I need to do. I don't know what exactly it will be, but like this is the problem I want to work on.
Yeah, which is like going all the way back to like the 70s and 80s, the nuclear disarmament. And this whole podcast focuses kind of on our adolescence as a species. We're talking about, you just mentioned the power wisdom gap, but the whole idea is, we're casting ourselves off as Icarus, and there's this degree to which it seems like we might be going on the route flying too high, too close to the sun, and that in doing so and seeking the power of gods like nuclear weapons or with climate change or many other things. A lot of your work is with bioweapons. We're really kind of we're tempting fate with things that we really don't understand. We're leaving the gun in the household.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm kind of wondering, you talk about kind of your ethics and what you're considering, and I know that a lot of your work has been influenced by Nick Bostrom and the ethical community, or the rationalist community, and I'm kind of wondering how you've kind of started framing this for yourselves in terms of looking at catastrophic risk and existential risk, looking into the future, and what problems you're most concerned about right now.
Yeah. So say a little bit more about what you mean by how I'm framing things. So you mentioned existential risk and catastrophic risk. Should I just say like how I see those terms, or where that's coming from?
Yeah. How do you consider, when you think about the ethical problems that we're faced with, how do you decide which problems to focus on, where to put your energy into, and then what have you come to in that process?
Okay. Yeah. So
Yeah.
I think, one of the things I admire about the sort of existential risk research community, which is,
Mm-hmm.
there's a number of organizations, but like Nick Bostrom and Future of Humanity Institute in Oxford sort of has like led the charge in that particular view, is that it's very future focused. It's saying, hey, we're this tiny speck in this giant universe. And there's so much time that we've just been, as a technological civilization, we've been around for like 10,000 years, and we can look back at history and see time in the perspective of millions or billions. We can look forward into the future and see time at the perspective of billions of years. Like if we sort of zoom out and we think about what's valuable to us, like yes, the present is super valuable, but like the future is just so rich with possibility. And sometimes this can be, I think, off-putting to people because it's hard to think at the level of billions. And it's also like we care about things that are near us. And it makes sense to care about things that are near us, like our families and our friends. And we absolutely should care about these things. But I think we have a sort of bias towards just forgetting about sort of how to put things into perspective. And so for me, I try to tie these things together somehow. So I try to say, well, if I have children or grandchildren, or my family has grandchildren, are they going to have a world that is worth living in, or even possible to live in? Like, are they even going to be around? And I think there's a really real possibility, and this is where this idea of existential risk comes in. There's a real risk of human extinction in our lifetimes, or in the next few generations, or even if it's just a real risk the next few thousand years, then that means that our great-grandchildren or great-great-grandchildren might not exist. And I think that would be like a horrible tragedy for everyone. Like, if you it's like the whole reason to have children or to have a community that's going to live on beyond yourself, or to have anything that's going to live on beyond yourself, is like some expectation that it will continue to live on, and and some possibility that it can be better than the present is, or that there can be improvement. And so I see this as sort of a fundamental human drive, or at least for me it is, and I think for a lot of people it is. And so it's like, if that's valuable, then making sure that there is that future is just super important.
Yeah. Well, if you had that, it's a failure of imagination, and it's a failure of being able to, if you were as intimate with those people as you are with the people that are close to you right now, if you could actually have that experience, if you could expand yourself in that sort of way, could you make the choices that you're making today? I think is a very real question. So what kind of, how's that influenced your work and like what you're looking at right now? What specific projects have you found to be most kind of meaningful in terms of trying to look at the risks that we have and to address them?
Yeah, so I think one thing that this has sort of inspired me to look at is try to get a better sense overall of what the big risks actually are. So I think it's a very difficult question to figure out sort of where the dominant risks are, because they may not necessarily be the ones that are most popular or draw the most attention. Because if you think about what leads a particular big societal risk to have attention drawn to it, is not necessarily the is it sort of logically the most pressing thing, right? It might be like, is it the thing that is going to be the most shareable via these news algorithms, right? Like, is it going to be the thing that Facebook is going to like uprank? Is it going to be the thing that YouTube's recommendation engine is going to right? So right, it's like these are some of the things that decide what things are sort of most on people's minds, and Hollywood and all these things, which will have some correlation with reality, but not a perfect one. And so for my own sake, just in order to sort of orient myself, I wanted to have a better sense of figuring out what this map looks like. What if we draw a map of the future, and of course it's going to be a probabilistic map of like what might happen. What are going to be the things, that the hazards that stand out? And a lot of people have done serious work on this. I think some of these are just extremely traditional sources, like IPCC, right? Like, this is a big one. Climate change is something we know about, and we've a lot of research has been done into mapping out climate risk. So that's something that needs to be on our map. As we talked about earlier, nuclear weapons, haven't gone away, are unlikely to go away in the near future. So that's a huge one. And you mentioned risk from biological technology. Something I don't think most people realize, or a lot of people realize, but a lot of people don't, is that we are undergoing incredible growth in the biotech sector right now. And there's been some, in the last 10 years, there's been incredible discoveries made, in particular in our ability to manipulate DNA and RNA and write like the very base code of life. So CRISPR-Cas9 is this really powerful gene editing tool that allows us to make much more precise edits on living organisms. So it's not only that we can have more precision with genetic engineering, it's that we can do things much cheaper and much faster. So it enables like grad students to be able to run their own experiments, where before it would have taken like a whole research team. Now a single grad student can do it, and they can do way more experiments, get much more data from their experiments. So like, I think it's really important to recognize that some of these fields are accelerating faster than others. Nuclear risk is continuing to be a big problem, but it's not. Technologically, it's not accelerating that much. It is, but like, we're developing, much faster missiles. We're developing, new sort of nuclear space technology. There's lots of technologies we are developing there, but it's not fundamentally the mechanics of a hydrogen bomb aren't changing. Whereas sort of fundamentally what we can do with biotech is changing. And another area that I would apply this to is, artificial intelligence. So there's a bunch of these things, and my motivation here is to both be able to have a better map for myself and to help other people create their own maps, right? So like sort of this collaborative sense-making process where people who are taking this long-term future orientation can get together and like, co-create this map. So, there's been a bunch of work already been done here. So I'm trying to help, bring this work together and add my own pieces to it.
Yeah. So if you could expand a little bit, I think on this on the biotech problem, kind of DIY bioweapons a little bit, and maybe other biotech problems that you're seeing, and lay out the map of maybe the less visible elements of the catastrophic risk landscape. When we look back and we see stuff going back to, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it's pretty obvious why humans were, probably the only reason why we survived the last century is because those things were just so apparent and in the public eye that it was impossible to not worry about it. Right. And so everybody put all this effort in, and miraculously we survived.
Yep.
But a lot of these other problems, IPCC, we have a different, it's very obvious, it's very public, but at the same time, it happens so slowly.
Yes.
Perhaps we don't actually have the actual energy. It's very arguable that we don't actually have the energy it takes to really address these problems in any way rational way as a group of societies in the international community. So what's if you were going to lay out the biorisk problem as perhaps one of the least understood problems, and maybe some of the other things that you're worried about that you maybe think are not big enough in the public consciousness, and talk about how we get past this problem of not having a sudden explosive thing that can kind of spark interest.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. I think you're totally right to say that biotech is one of the areas, and sort of this entire risk of, biological risk is one of these areas that's very poorly understood. In part because, it's not very flashy, and it's very hard to see what's actually going on. It's also not obvious to me that sort of raising awareness of it is like the most important thing to do, right? Like
you can incentivize people to,
yeah, and I'm not even that worried about sort of people getting ideas and creating dangerous stuff. Although that's certainly a small concern, but it's more that there can sometimes be media overreaction to things that doesn't cause actually the right responses. So. It's a very hard question of how you prioritize resources, even within a field like biosecurity. But I think it is, so what I will encourage people to do is to think seriously about problems, and don't freak out. Don't be like, oh no, so I'm going to get smallpox in the Ebola tomorrow because of biohackers. You're like, that's not what's going to happen. But I mean, right, I think the sort of responsible approach is to be like, with some epistemic humility, to say, how can we better understand these things? And with the knowledge that like, a deep and difficult understanding is what's required in order to make progress, rather than sort of a raise the alarm, we're all going to die. Like it's sort of the opposite of careful thinking, right? Like careful thinking sort of requires some sort of like slowness, or like it requires some sort of slowing down to deeply consider things. I don't always follow this advice myself, but I think this is sort of the thing I would endorse. Yeah. So with the state of biology right now, we are getting to the point where we can just sort of do most things in molecular biology with much less money and skill and effort required than we used to be able to. And I think that one concern that people have is that this empowers sort of malicious individuals who might wish to kill a lot of people. It makes it much easier for them. It lowers the barriers to them being able to do that, and that is true. And about it, a year or two ago, I was actually pretty worried about this as a sort of near-term threat, and now I'm a little less worried about it. Not that it's not a concern. Again, it's sort of this: how do you weight these things? It's a little tricky, but I'm less worried about it because. Well, actually, there's already a lot of ways that a person who is smart enough to use a computer to do sort of complex research, and to maybe say, use a biology lab, or even using a normal engineering lab or a normal whatever lab to make something very destructive. Like there are already a lot of ways that they can do that, and so as technologies enable individual actors to sort of do even more destructive stuff, currently. And this could change, but currently they are more limited, where it's more limiting that there aren't many of these people who are both smart and capable and wanting to do destructive things. and not just any destructive things, like destructive things that are like sort of efficiently destructive, that are destructive on a large scale. I think there's lots of people who want to have lots of press coverage, but like you can get press coverage just by killing a few people, relative few. Like we're talking numbers of, if someone goes into a church or a mosque and kills 20 people, well, that's horrifying, and it's horrifying in a way that will catch media attention. And that same person might not, attempt to go create a virus that will kill 10,000 people, because to them it might not be any different. And I think we're very fortunate that that's the case. Like we're very fortunate that it's the case that for the most part, most people who want to cause harm are not thinking about efficient and like effective harm causing, which is great. I hope that doesn't change. So because of that, because that's a limiting factor, even though sort of this advance in biotech is enabling more of that kind of thing, we're not actually seeing more of those events happening, and so, like bioterrorism has been possible for a number of decades. I think we have some cases from like the 80s and 90s, or maybe like 2 or 3 cases that all resulted in like, either a few people got sick or a few people died, but it was all like, under like 20 people, which, compared to other sorts of violent acts is not at all bad. And it wasn't because it wasn't because no one knew how to do this. Like we've known for a while how to say, create anthrax. And it was very hard, admittedly, but there weren't that many attempts. So we can also look at, attempts to successes. So there's a lot of factors that go into this. So that's sort of like bioterrorism. One thing I'm more worried about, and I think it's much less attention. I mean, bioterrorism is at least sexy enough to make movies about. So like, if you go to Washington, D.C. and you talk about bioterrorism, people will know what you're talking about. People will talk about that. There's 2 other things within this whole like realm of biological risk that get less attention. One of them, is state-sponsored bioweapon research. One of the problems with this is that, but unlike nuclear weapons, you can research biological weapons in a way that's much more secret. This is much harder to track. And so what I worry about is like states like North Korea, or states like really any state that sort of has an incentive to create pretty powerful weapons, doing so in secret and making advances in that field in the way that won't be obvious to the public eye. And then we sort of have an unknown unknowns problem where maybe someone has created a really powerful weapon and we don't know about it. Fortunately, we're a little protected from this because right now there aren't a lot of incentives to develop biological weapons by states, because unlike nuclear weapons, one of the things that makes a nuclear weapon so effective for a country, not from a moral perspective, but from a strategic perspective, is that you can clearly demonstrate that you have one. You can just do a nuclear test and then everyone can tell with their satellites that you have this very powerful weapon. A biological weapon doesn't work that way. You can't really do that, right? So like it's very difficult to actually test in a way that is credible to other people. So that's a thing that's protecting us. Like, we are developing technology that makes, pretty terrifying weapons possible. But currently there's not a lot of incentive to develop them or create them. And so this brings me to the third category that I'm quite concerned about, that almost no one is talking about. So these first 2, this is the thing that, traditional biosecurity cares a lot about and spends some time thinking about. This third category, I think, is very underappreciated and very important. And the problem with this third category is that there are many incentives to develop this tech. And this is basically the ability to design and engineer organisms that can outcompete sort of natural life. So this might be something pretty mundane, like, let's create a new type of wheat that can fix nitrogen by itself. Nitrogen is a limiting factor in most kinds of plant growth, so they have to get it from the soil. But a very few number of plants have the ability to fix nitrogen out of the air. They just sort of grab it and incorporate it, and that allows them to grow in a lot of areas that they couldn't otherwise grow. Now, if you can suddenly make wheat as something that can do that also, and by the way, if there are any like plant biologists in the audience, they're going to be like, "That's ridiculous! You couldn't do that." Not with nitrogen fixing in general, but with wheat in particular. Like I just chose that example at random. But so you have your wheat,
Sure.
and suddenly you've given that plant the ability to do something that in the natural environment it could never do. And so potentially you've basically given this natural form of life an artificial advantage. And like that example, that particular case may not be that bad. Like at worst, you've created a super weed that like will go and grow everywhere. And people have talked about that. That could be sort of bad, but it wouldn't be bad at the level of like some of these other things, these existential catastrophes. But if you could make a microbe, say some form of algae or something that was sort of had some, maybe it had a great, immune advantage, like it was resistant to pathogens, or say it had it was incredibly efficient at photosynthesis via some newly discovered pathway that we found. You have a situation where, either intentionally or more likely accidentally, some form of engineered life is capable of just greatly outcompeting natural life. And this could destabilize ecosystems at a pretty large scale. And to some extent, this is a hard problem to solve because nature is not really sort of the source code of nature, right? Like all the living organisms sort of have this fairly stable set of genes, and this fluctuations is evolution, but it happens on pretty slow timescales. And if there's something like a vulnerability in these genes or in these ecologies, really, a vulnerability that human engineering can exploit, but natural selection cannot, then you have this problem of like, okay, now we know that if you develop this like super wheat nitrogen fixing weed, it will like take over large ecosystems that we don't want it to take over. How do you stop that? Well, you could like go and try to spray weed killer everywhere, but it's self-replicating. So now you've just created something that is very hard to get rid of. And once you've created the information from it, potentially anyone could sort of, take that information and go and grow the plant themselves. And so this is something sort of analogous to, computer security, which I didn't mention, but I actually work professionally in as a field. After biology, I decided to do that for a day job. So in computer security, we have this problem where you have a vulnerability in software, and the way they fix that problem is that you update your software. You go and you're like, all right, I need to update this, or it does it automatically. We can't easily do that with ecosystems. We can't just be like, all right, apply the patch, it's fine. The wheat can't grow here anymore. We fixed it. So we have a problem where like, if it turns out that these kinds of things are easy to engineer, and they may not be, we don't know. I think there are some reasons to think that this is in fact possible, and maybe even pretty plausible within the next few decades. And if that turns out to be the case, we don't have an easy way to deal with this problem. Unlike these other two, I think there actually is a lot of incentive to develop organisms that are sort of much more powerful than natural organisms. Crops is the example I'm using here, but also, developing microbes that can produce medicines very efficiently and quickly. Is another application, and there are many applications. So this is sort of an example of like, oh man, I'm looking at this risk map and I'm saying what's not on here, and I'm like, oh, this is something that's not on here. It's not that no one knows about this, but it's the kind of thing where, given I think how important it is, very few people are talking about it, both within the professional community and without.
Great. Yeah. Well, we'll have to get back into cryptography and security, as well as talking about the future of ecosystems later on. But I think we've freaked people out enough in this little piece of the conversation, and I really want to bring this back to maybe where the solution space looks like it might be. And I know that you've got a pretty good understanding in a lot of the talks that you've given before of some of this history of various approaches to, both attempt to end the human race, but also various attempts that people have made to try to slow down that process and kind of do some of that deliberate discernment that I think you were talking about, not just at the beginning of that. So I'm wondering, which of those are giving you the most hope, and how do you think those could be applied in small scale contexts that people actually have real access to?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I think it's easy to focus on the sort of potential risks and ways that things could be terrible, and if
Which
we
we'll
only,
get back.
and if we only do that, we're not going to make any progress. So I think there are actually a lot of things that give me hope. Sometimes these are different on the small scale and the large scale. Let me start with some large scale ones, and then some small scale ones, and then I think I can say a few things for how I think these are actually related, even though they don't seem very related. So one, we talked about this the other day, and I was thinking about what institutions actually exist, or sort of what has happened in the past that gives me hope about humans' ability to sort of have wisdom when it comes to powerful technology or potentially big risk factors. And it's very easy to be cynical here, and for somewhat good reason, but also I think it's just we have a tendency to be cynical. And so I can sort of point at the UN and the Security Council as actual signs of real progress. And people are going to feel somewhat surprised, but I think we're so steeped in cynicism that we're like, well, what do you mean these institutions are horrible? And I'm like, hold on, we actually have international institutions that can do things. Now they're not perfect, and sure, like there's a lot of problems. But there was a long time, and in fact, most of human history, we had nothing like this. We had no international institutions. The idea of an international institution was crazy. Like if you were like, hey, let's like take all these kingdoms and make like a meta kingdom that like sort of does some stuff, people would have been like, what are you talking about? You can't do that. Like my king's going to kill your king. Like that's not a thing. Sure, we can make a treaty maybe, but you can't create some sort of overall body that like relates to these things. So I want to like give humanity credit for at least making any international institutions, and like we've done that, so I think that's great. So I think that even though like the sort of the cool thing to do is to be very cynical about the UN, and especially the Security Council, I think we need to like step back and be like, yes, these institutions are very imperfect, and no, we shouldn't expect them to solve all of these problems, but like we do have them, and that's actually a very important first step, because it establishes in everyone's minds and everyone's culture that this kind of thing is possible. And I think one of the things that I have discovered recently in my own research into nuclear risk is around the 40s and 50s, sort of the sort of scientific leaders, and especially physicists, but sort of the scientific leaders in not just the United States, but really all over the world, it was actually before the 40s, but it sort of came together in the 40s with the use of nuclear weapons. You had a bunch of people who were saying, hold on, like this is a big problem. Like we now have these incredibly powerful weapons, and we really need better global governance of this. And they had some pretty powerful ambitions about how we could have global governance. Yeah. I have this book on my shelf called One World or None. And it's like Einstein's in there and Niels Bohr's in there.
Yeah, Einstein was a huge advocate for this kind of stuff. I was just reading his biography a year ago, and he's just, he was talking about that constantly, along with pacifism, which he kind of backed off of. But yeah, continue. Sorry.
Yeah. No, and I think it's this. Yeah. We've I feel like culturally we've almost forgotten that some of our like sort of biggest heroes were all about this, and they were all about this vision of like, can we create a world that's more cooperative than our one right now? And they were optimistic. They're like, yes, this is going to be very hard, but we can actually do it. And I think we've lost some of that optimism. And again, somewhat there's some reason for losing that optimism, but I think we can get it back. I think that like they were on the right track, and they were thinking about solutions in somewhat the right way. And like my thought is that we can get back to that point somehow.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a piece. And even say like the Security Council, which is like a weird collection of like adversaries to some extent, but like are willing to cooperate on some things, I think is an interesting case of like cooperation despite like a lot of bad history. And so I think that's an interesting one. More optimistic than that is sort of the progress that we've made, which is now being eroded, unfortunately. But a lot of the progress we've made on nuclear treaties, and I think this is a huge deal because, you know, if you look at the number of nuclear weapons in the world today, yes, there are thousands. Yes, that's awful. But like there are thousands and not tens of thousands. So you know, we have this huge reduction in number of nuclear weapons, which in some ways has made us safer. And not only did we, you know, sort of both the US and Russia voluntarily reduce their nuclear stockpiles, they also agreed on a bunch of other things that they wouldn't do. And they limit themselves in terms of what military systems they were going to deploy, you know, these sort of, you know, intermediate range ballistic missiles and a bunch of these other things where, you know, you have these countries that are, you know, basically, you know, these huge military empires that were like, hold on, this is enough. Like, we are both going to be better off if we don't go down this thing. And I don't know if I can point to a lot of times when, you know, humanity has kind of said, hold on, let's not go down that path. That path is too dangerous. Even though, you know, we're threatening each other with like this total genocide and annihilation, let's not do it in that way. Yeah. And like, that's actually significant. It's actually profound. And I think, you know, we also might point at sort of the you know, lack of use of chemical weapons during World War II as another case of this, where we sort of agreed not to use this weapon anymore.
Yeah, or the ozone layer in the 70s, right? Or
yeah. So that's a great example where you know, when there wasn't any, you know, I'm sort of pointing at the hardest cases, right? Like the nuclear weapons where it's like, you know, this is actually an antagonism, but even despite this antagonism, we can work together, and like that's impressive to me. The ozone layer stuff, I feel like is a great example of like, hold on, when incentives are really aligned, we will totally solve those problems. And like, it will take the hard work of some people, because it's not that everyone's incentives are aligned, right? It's like, it's that the large, you know, I will make the argument that, you know, actually everyone's incentives are aligned. We just don't know how to work.
Yes. Yeah.
So that's a large scale view, because I think it's very easy to be super pessimistic about the large scale and be like, we'll never make any progress. But like, no, we have actually made progress. And then I think on in the short term, or not the short term, but on the small scale, what can we do as you know, tiny individuals? I think that there's a real power for, as individuals, you know, what can we do within our communities that will have lasting long-term impact? And I think one of the things that's underappreciated here is that if you plan to have long-term impact, and that can be at the community scale, I don't mean at the global scale, I just mean like, if you can, you know, within your local community, make a plan and sort of, you know, practice it and execute it together with your friends, with your family, with your community, you can like have an outsized impact on the future by sort of explicitly planning for the long term. And there's something sort of counterintuitive here, which is that it seems like the long term would be hardest to impact and the short term would be easiest. But I think this is actually not true. And I think this is not true both the level of the small scale and the large scale. And the reason I think this is true is it's sort of an evolutionary argument, and it's the idea is if you're in a pool, like a you know, group of agents that are mostly populated by short-term optimizers, you know, if you're trying to aggressively short-term optimize, you're now in direct competition with a bunch of other short-term optimizers. But if you're like willing to, you know, make some sacrifices in the short-term efficiency in order and go after the long-term efficiency, well, now the pool of people you're competing with is much smaller, because very few people are actually trying to do that. So I think this gives me hope both at the small level and the large level of like, look, if we plan with the intention of having long-term impact, you know, our efforts will just go much further, because you know, there's so much less noise at that level. And this isn't easy to do, but I think it is actually much more possible than people think.
Yeah. Well, real quick, I was just wondering if there's any municipalities or bodies of governance at the level of research or at the level of civil society? Any sort of kind of groups that you've seen that in your own research have kind of stood out to you, or as examples of like really powerful action at the local scale?
So this is a tricky one because I think that what I've seen instead is a lot of, so if I look back into the like 40s and 50s, this is more of the cautionary tale than the positive example.
No, that's all right. Yeah.
Looking at, say, nuclear advocacy groups, a lot of the grassroots ones and the local activist ones sort of didn't succeed at the long-term planning. What ended up happening was, some of them still exist and are full of, like pretty cool, maybe older hippies that are like still doing their thing. And I think that's great. But it's interesting that sort of, as those people aged, they weren't able to take in more people, or they didn't, that sort of wasn't their orientation. They were very focused on a short-term issue, which was, I think, an incredibly important issue. And I wonder if they had sort of more carefully crafted a strategy to make sure that their community and their effort had more lasting effect or lasting impact, if it would sort of be, more around or more healthy today. I will let me give a positive example now. A lot of the organizations that I've been involved with are pretty new. So like the Future of Humanity Institute, and there's like the Center for the Study of Existential Risk at Cambridge, Machine Intelligence Research Institute, MIRI in Berkeley. These are Future Life Institute, and so a lot of these organizations are fairly new. So we can't really apply this test to them. But in this sort of like large scale risk and futurist orientation organizations, one of them that's been around for actually quite a long time is the Foresight Institute in San Francisco. I think they've been around like 30 or 40 years. And so they're like one of the, actually, which in this space is actually a pretty long time. And, that's an organization that, I like frequently go to their events, and, they are like continuing to be vibrant and continuing to draw in new people, and have actually sort of done this intergenerational transfer where like I'm also friends with, Kristen Peterson, who works in this, who was like the leader for a really long time and is now sort of passing on the torch. And I'm like, this is exactly what I want to see, right? Like I want to see more organizations doing this and more communities who are like really doing this, passing on the torch business, where, they're sort of planning for the intergenerational impact, which is really cool.
What's the story of what kind of prompted their kind of entrance into that field, and what got them started 40 years ago?
Yeah, I should talk to Christine more. I don't actually know what originally got them started. I think originally early on they were pretty focused on nanotechnology and with Eric Drexler.
Oh yeah.
So that was I think some of the early efforts. And then eventually they got a bunch of other people involved. I don't quite know the history of that, but I bet it's fascinating.
Yeah. Well, one thing that I've talked about previously on the podcast has been actually the erosion of institutions like the UN with a international policy expert. And and one of the things he talked about was this kind of total. We started with basically just liberal values that were kind of embedded into the UN from its beginning, and all these ideas about international law, about not doing war crimes, all these sorts of things.
Yeah.
Have been things that we've gotten worse and worse at over time, rather than better and better at. And he's talking about how he's got kind of some more left-wing ideas, but really he's just fighting to keep these kind of liberal ideas. He gets attacked for defending them. And so I'm kind of curious for you, how do you see as a way of kind of keeping the erosion of institutions like this from happening? How do you kind of create that resilience and robustness?
So I'm really excited about this question, because I think it's sort of the question, I think. So I think basically, we can do this risk mapping. We can say, look, these are the large scale risks. And I think in order to deal with these, we have to have healthy functioning institutions. like individually we can't do anything, and to some extent we can do very broad things in social movements. So I think social movements do play a really important role, but social movements can't do very fine-grained or long-term planning type things. Like we need institutions to do that. And so, like it is a real problem that the UN is becoming more dysfunctional. Like that's a huge problem in the world, I think. And I don't know. Well, so sorry. One thing I want to say is that I think that from an evolutionary perspective, what we're actually seeing here, and this is somewhat counterintuitive, but I think what we're seeing here is the senescence of institutions. With senescence, the aging process, basically.
Right. Yeah.
And that it's actually the natural course, not good, but sort of the default course for institutions to get worse over time. And I think this is a problem that we have to approach pretty directly, and we have to study it pretty directly. We have to say, okay, overall we see that this is like by far, in the vast majority of cases, this is what happens to institutions. We someone creates them, or some group of people create them, and sometimes they go strong for a while, but then they inevitably decay. With some very rare exceptions, they might last for thousands of years, but they usually don't. And so, and there's this question of, even in the case where they did last for thousands of years, did they still sort of embody the purpose they originally set out to? And I think that, I could say like sort of what I think might help, but I want to step back a little from that and say, this is a very difficult problem. And like, I think we need to have some epistemic humility here to say that we really don't know the solution to this, or, because I think the solution to this will be very complex. Like it's a very complex problem. But I think it is something that we can like learn more about. And so what I think we should do is basically try to study this problem of like institutional decay and try to figure out, how we can build institutions that have immune systems, that have the ability to self-repair. Like there's some enormous design challenge of like, how can we design better institutions that, can, maybe they have offspring, maybe they like replace themselves with better institutions. I don't know how that will work. But I think that like, that is the right question.
Yeah, well, I think I've heard Paul Krugman talk about how, the basically more universal economic policies tend to have a better lifetime and tend to degrade at a slower pace. So at some level, you're saying it's complex, and I think I actually very much agree with you. But I think, in the end, what complex systems have is they're not this patchwork kind of deal. They're actually, in some level, something simple that's allowed to create a self-organizing structure.
Yeah.
And so it feels to me that like the design space somehow has to relate to these kind of fundamental core things that are capable of, essentially growing themselves, right? Yeah. And that's what creates that that self-healing process that you were just talking about. So I'm wondering, when you think about problems like economics, and I know you've worked a little bit in the blockchain space, or when you look at problems in education or in governance and around democracy, what sorts of structures to you seem like they might have the most potential to kind of evolve into complex systems rather than, humans trying to patch everything?
Yeah. So I spent a year working in the blockchain space, and this is one of the very few places in that space I'm actually excited about. I mean, I think it's it has a, so like financial, I think, in terms of financial technology, there's some, I think, fairly exciting applications, but I think most of the applications that people talk about, I think, won't work or are not exciting, or like, there's a lot of hype and not a lot of substance. But I think one area where there is substance, and I think a very important substance, is in this space of governance experimentation. So I think one of the problems we have in institutions is it's very difficult to run experiments. If I want to say, hey, let's, I want to institute a prediction market to try to, have this institution make decisions via the prediction market. It's very hard. It's very hard to do. You can't just like easily spin up an institution in order to do that. You have to play a lot of political games. You have to do a lot of other things. And then there's incentives to sort of distort the outcomes. All sorts of trouble. And one of the things I see sort of, some blockchain platforms, especially Ethereum, doing is that it's both at the technology level, but also at the cultural level, making it possible to do some of these governance experiments. So Vitalik has written a bunch about this, and I think he has a big paper with Glen Weyl on what is it called? Radicals. It's something, but basically it's sort of using it's a very interesting sort of some new approaches to how to do governance better, and sort of to take advantage of some pretty cool voting systems to try to sort of solve commons problems and things in this space. And so yeah, I'm pretty excited by their efforts, and like even if they don't succeed at the object level, the fact that they're creating a culture that does experimentation in the governance design process, I think is super important. And I like really want to see more of that done.
Yeah. Well, and I think Reserve, a lot of what Reserve was looking at some level was actually looking at the risks that are associated with the creation of these systems. And there's some pretty simple ones from, basically, incentivizing people to really, basically scam other people with code that they don't understand, right? Or, be like, oh yeah, this is super secure. It'll do itself automatically. It's a smart contract. The smart contract is set up to screw them over. Or, manipulating things with, when we saw the DAO split. And I'm wondering what sorts of solutions you're seeing for those kinds of problems, or like perhaps what problems that we can address that don't run into as many of those issues, and if that's changing at all when we're thinking about post-quantum cryptography and the kind of new elements that are coming in the next decade or so.
So you mean particularly for those technology platforms, like how will it, yeah. So I think the security aspect of this is pretty interesting. Yeah, I think one thing we figured out pretty quickly at Reserve is that security is expensive, and this is not obvious to, I think, everyone in the space. Like, so, we have some. It's often hard to sort of justify, especially for startups, expenditure into security, because the incentives are pretty stacked against you. I think if you're in the financial technology sector, you have a lot more incentive too. So that's actually a counterbalancing force. But in general, if you're just developing some, random sort of service, you're in danger of running out of funds. You're much more in danger of running out of funds than you are from getting your database hacked and leaking all of your customer data. Like, even if that does happen, you might survive, but if you run out of funds, you definitely won't. So like already, in this space, and it does extend to the blockchain space, you're already having these terrible incentive problems. So I think a lot of times we look at these security problems and we're like, this technology is really difficult. And it's like, well, yeah, but a lot of it we actually know how to do. Like, we do know how to write secure smart contracts. It's just very expensive and it's very difficult, So the way you do it, right, is like, you try to hire good engineers and you have good security engineers, and then you hire a very, reputable auditing firm, and they go through your smart contract and they look at it line by line, and they give you very close feedback on that. And there's all sorts of sort of formal verification you can do, but it's expensive, right? It's expensive and it's difficult. And so it's not that we don't know how to do it, we totally do, but it's that the incentives are stacked not in your favor. So I think that's sort of going to be the fundamental problem with any of these systems, is that if we can't fix the underlying incentives, which include sort of information asymmetries, right? So like one of the problems is that if you're a customer, a new customer in a new piece of technology, whether it's blockchain or not, you are not, as an average person, going to have much visibility into how secure the thing is that you're using, because a lot of the sort of decisions that are being made about the security of that platform are illegible to you. So like, maybe they did get a great audit to their code, but maybe they didn't, and like, maybe you know that, or maybe you don't, but like, as an average user, you don't even know what an audit is. So it's like not even a question to you, but this really matters, right? So if we can, so one of the ways we could, help restructure incentives is improving transparency into security for technology platforms like this, which I think is one of the things that blockchain platforms do sort of by design, which is that, if if say, sort of fundamentally Bitcoin was very hackable, it would be very obvious. We'd all see that, right? Because it's something that
Yeah.
computers, and the blockchains that are hackable, aren't around anymore or aren't very valuable now. So there is sort of this natural accountability that's nice in those systems.
Yeah.
When it comes to quantum computing, I think this is a real problem for existing blockchains, and I think I'm very curious to see how they will try to transition from existing sort of non-safe, non-quantum safe crypto algorithm to a quantum safe crypto algorithm.
Right.
It seems possible, especially with Bitcoin, I wonder, because it's very difficult to do hard forks. And this is totally the kind of thing where you could do a hard fork with. And I sort of expect this to happen at some point. But it's a hard coordination problem. But I think I'm overall optimistic about this because there are algorithms that we know of, and there are kinds of cryptography that are quantum resistant or quantum proof. So that basically you can.
Yeah.
And so it's really just a incentive problem, because I think on the actual tech side of things, we're going to figure this out. We are already figuring it out. It's not a fundamentally hard problem in cryptography to make quantum resistant algorithms. It's just a difficult problem. And we're good at solving difficult problems if we have the incentive to.
Yeah, great. All right. Well, I'm kind of wondering to kind of wrap things up, if we can kind of have a quick conversation, or if you can kind of spread out some resources that have been most influential and for you, and perhaps what sorts of things that you'd recommend for listeners in order to educate themselves on these issues and to get involved.
Yeah, it's always a tricky one, because I don't know what readers may have already encountered. So I'm going to try to maybe pick a few things that they're less likely to have encountered. Though I don't know if that's going to be right. So I think I talked about game theory and evolutionary theory a bit here. So Thomas Schelling, a game theorist, wrote The Strategy of Conflict, and I think it's a great sort of good theoretical take on how to think about game theory from the perspective of actors that have some incentive to cooperate but some incentive to not. It's a very different way of thinking, and I think it's quite important for sort of understanding the world. Of course, The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins is just a classic. I imagine a lot of you have already read this, but if you haven't, just put it high on your list, because it's really fundamental to understanding evolutionary biology. Let's see. So I mentioned Glen Weyl. I think his research in the governance space is pretty interesting. I've been collaborating some with Samo Berja. I can link to that, but he's basically he's working on researching functional institutions and trying to figure out some of these problems that we were talking about today about how to make institutions that can be resistant to senescence in this way. So I think that's another interesting person who's working on that particular piece. I think a key thing here, so what I've been thinking about a lot in the last few months is, how can we make our local communities more long-term focused? And I think that's just like a really big element missing in most conversations around this right now. And I don't have a very practical suggestion for like how to make this actionable, but I would love to see more people writing about it and talking about it. Just sort of like, are we whatever communities you're a part of, do you think that they'll still be around in 60 years? Do you want them to still be around in 60 years? And if so, like, how is that going to happen? Because it's really not going to happen automatically. And I think that's something that, for, people like me in our 20s, it's really hard to intuit that it's not going to happen automatically, but it's totally not.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much, Jeffrey. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks.